Chapter 33. Paul Chancellor had been angry with Percy Threat. Violently angry. When he found out about the message from Brian Standish. "You deceived me," Paul had shouted at Percy. "You deliberately made sure I was out of the way before you showed it to Flick." "It's true, but it seemed best." "I'm in command. You have no right to withhold information from me." "I thought you would have aborted the flight." "Perhaps I would have. Maybe I should have. But you would have done it for love of Flick, not because it was right operationally." There, Percy had touched Paul's weak spot, for Paul had compromised his position as leader by sleeping with one of his team. That had made him more angry, but he had been forced to suppress his rage. They could not contact Flick's plane, for flights over enemy territory had to observe radio silence. So the two men had stayed at the airfield all night, smoking and pacing, and worrying about the woman they both, in different ways, loved. Paul had in his shirt pocket the wooden French toothbrush he and Flick had shared on Friday morning, after their night together. He was not normally superstitious, but he kept touching it as if he were touching her, making sure she was okay. When the plane returned and the pilot told them how Flick had become suspicious of the reception committee at Chatel, and had eventually dropped near Chartres, Paul had been so relieved he almost wept. Minutes later, Percy had taken a call from SOE headquarters in London and had learned of Brian Standish's message demanding to know what had gone wrong. Paul had decided to respond by sending the reply drafted by Flick and brought home by her pilot. In case Brian was still at liberty, it told him that the Jackdaws had landed and would contact him, but it gave no further information because of the possibility that he was in the hands of the Gestapo. Still, no one was sure what had happened out there. The uncertainty was unbearable for Paul. Flick had to go to Reims, one way or another. He had to know whether she was walking into a Gestapo trap. Surely there must be a way to check whether Brian's transmissions were genuine. His signals bore the correct security tags. Percy double-checked, but the Gestapo knew about security tags, and they could easily have tortured Brian to learn his. There was subtler methods of checking. Percy said, but they depended on the girls at the listening station, so Paul had decided to go there. At first, Percy had resisted. It was dangerous for operational people to descend on signals units. He said, they disrupted the smooth running of the service for hundreds of agents. Paul ignored that. Then the head of the station said he would be delighted for Paul to make an appointment to visit in, say, 2 or 3 weeks. No, Paul had said 2 or 3 hours is what I had in mind. He had insisted gently but firmly, using the threat of Monty's wrath as a last resort. and so he had gone to Grundon Underwood. As a small boy in Sunday school, Paul had been vexed by a theological problem. He had noticed that in Arlington, Virginia, where he was living with his parents, most of the children of his age went to bed at the same time, 7:30. That meant they were saying their prayers simultaneously, with all those voices rising to heaven. How could God hear what he, Paul, was saying? He was not satisfied with the answer of the pastor, who just said that God could do anything. Little Paul knew that was an evasion. The question troubled him for years. If he could have seen Grundon Underwood, he would have understood. Like God, the special operations executive had to listen to innumerable messages, and it often happened that scores of them came in at the same time. Secret agents in their hideaways were all tapping their Morse keys simultaneously, like the 9-year-olds of Arlington kneeling at their bedsides at 7:30, and so he heard them all. Grundon Underwood was another grand country house, vacated by the owners and taken over by the military, officially called Station 53A. It was a listening post. In its extensive grounds were radio aerials, grouped in great arcs like the ears of God, listening to messages that came from anywhere between the Arctic north of Norway to the dusty south of Spain. 400 wireless operators and coders, most of them young women in their fannies, worked in the big house and lived in Nissen, huts hastily erected on the grounds. Paul was shown around by a supervisor, Jean Bevins, a heavy woman with spectacles. At first she was terrified of the visiting big shot, who represented Montgomery himself. But Paul smiled and talked softly, and made her feel at ease. She took him to the transmitting room, where 100 or so girls sat in rows, each with headphones, notebooks, and pencils. A big board showed agents, code names, and scheduled times for transmissions, known as skeeds, and always pronounced the American way, and the frequencies they would use. There was an atmosphere of intense concentration, the only sound being the tap of Morse code as an operator told an agent she was receiving him loud and clear. Jean introduced Paul to Lucy Briggs, a pretty blonde girl with a Yorkshire accent so strong that he had to concentrate hard to understand her. "Helicopter," she said. I know helicopter." "He's new. He calls in at 2000 hours and receives at 2300. No problem so far." She never pronounced the letter H. Once Paul realized that he began to find it easier to interpret the accent. "What do you mean?" he asked her. "What sort of problems do you get?" "Well, some of them don't tune the transmitter right, so you have to search for the frequency. Then the signal may be weak, so that you can't hear the letters very well. And you worry that you might be mistaking dashes for dots. The letter B is very like D, for instance, and the tone is always bad from those little suitcase radios, because they are so small." "Would you recognize his fist?" She looked dubious. "He's only broadcast 3 times, On Wednesday, he was a bit nervous, probably because it was his first, but his pace was steady as if he knew he had plenty of time. I was pleased. I thought he must feel reasonably safe. We worried about them, you know. We're sitting here nice and warm, and they're somewhere behind enemy lines, dodging the bloody Gestapo. What about his second broadcast? That was Thursday, and he was rushed. When they're in a hurry, it can be difficult to be sure what they mean. You know, was that 2 dots run together, or a short dash? Wherever he was sending them from, he wanted to get out of there fast. And then, Friday, he didn't broadcast, but I didn't worry. They didn't call unless they have to. It's dangerous. Then he came on the air on Saturday morning, just before dawn. It was an emergency message, but he didn't sound panicky. In fact, I remember thinking to myself, he's getting the hang of this. You know, it was a strong signal. The rhythm was steady, all the letters clear. Could have been someone else using his transmitter that time? She looked thoughtful. It sounded like him, but yes, it could have been someone else. I suppose, and if it was a German, pretending to be him, they would sound nice and steady, wouldn't they? Because they'd have nothing to fear. Paul felt as if he were wading through gumbo. Every question he asked had 2 answers. He yearned for something definite. He had to fight down a panic every time he recalled to mind the dreadful prospect that he might lose Flick. Less than a week after she had come into his life like a gift from the gods. Jean had disappeared and returned now with a sheaf of papers in a plump hand. "I've brought the decrypts of the 3 signals received from helicopter," she said. Her quiet efficiency pleased him. He looked at the first sheet. Call sign helicopter. Security tag present. May 30th, 1944. Message reads, "Arrived okay. Stop crypt. Rendezvous unsafe. Stop nabbed by Gestapo. But got away. Stop in future rendezvous at Café de la Gare over." "He can't spell for nuts," Paul commented. "It's not his spelling," Jean said. "They've always make errors in the Morse. We ordered the decoders to leave them in the decrypt, rather than tidy them up, in case there is some significance." Brian's second transmission, giving the strength of the Bollinger circuit, was longer. Call sign helicopter. Security tag present. May 31st, 1944. Message reads, "Active agents number 5 as follows. Stop Monette, who is wounded. Stop Comtesse. Okay, stop. Cheval helps occasionally. Stop Bourgis. Still I'm place stop plus my rescuer code name Charlton. Stop." Paul looked up. "This is much worse." Lucy said, "I told you he was in a rush the second time." There was more of the second message, mainly a detailed account of the incident at the cathedral. Paul went on to the third. Call sign helicopter. Security tag present. June 2nd, 1944. Message reads, "What the devil happened? Curry sent instructions. Stop reply immediately over." "He's improving," Paul said. "Only one mistake." I thought he was more relaxed on Saturday," Lucy said. "Either that or someone else sent the signal." Suddenly, Paul thought he saw a way to test whether Brian was himself or a Gestapo impersonator. If it worked, it would at least give him certainty. Lucy, do you ever make mistakes in transmissions? Hardly ever. She threw an anxious glance at her supervisor. If a new girl is a bit careless, the agent will kick up a hell of a stink. Quite rightly too. There should never be any mistakes. The agents have enough problems to cope with. Paul turned to Jean. If I draft a message, would you encode it exactly as it is? It would be a kind of test. Of course. He looked at his watch. It was 7:30 p.m. You should broadcast at 8. Can you send it then? The supervisor said. Yes, when he calls in, we'll just tell him to stand by to receive all emergency message immediately after transmission. Paul sat down, thought for a moment, then wrote on a pad. Give your arms how man automates how my stands also ammo. How many rounds each plus grenades. Reply immediately. He considered it for a moment. It was an unreasonable request, phrased in a high-handed tone, and it appeared to be carelessly encoded and transmitted. He showed it to Jean. She frowned. That's a terrible message. I'd be ashamed of it. What do you think an agent's reaction would be? She gave a humorless laugh. He would send an angry reply with a few stray words in it. Please encode it exactly as it is and send it to helicopter. She looked troubled. If that's the way you wish. Yes, please. Of course. She took it away. Paul went in search of food. The canteen operated 24 hours a day, as the station did, but the coffee was tasteless, and there was nothing to eat but some stale sandwiches and dried-up cake. A few minutes after 8 o'clock, the supervisor came into the canteen. Helicopter called in to say he had had no word yet from Leopardus. We're sending him the emergency message now. Thank you. It would take Brian or his Gestapo impersonator at least an hour to decode the message. Compose a reply, encode it, and transmit it. Paul stared at his plate, wondering how the British had the nerve to call this a sandwich. 2 pieces of white bread, smeared with margarine, and 1 thin slice of ham. No mustard. Chapter 34. The red light district of Paris was a neighborhood of narrow, dirty streets on a low hill behind the Rue de la Chapelle, not far from the Gare du Nord. At its heart was La Charbon, the Rue de la Charbonnière. On the north side of the street, the convent of La Chapelle stood like a marble statue in a junkyard. The convent consisted of a tiny church and a house where 8 nuns dedicated their lives to helping the most wretched of Parisians. They made soup for starving old men, talked depressed women out of suicide, dragged drunk sailors from the gutter, and taught the children of prostitutes to read and write. Next door to the convent stood the Hotel de la Chapelle. The hotel was not exactly a brothel, for there were no whores in residence. But when the place was not full, the proprietress was willing to rent rooms by the hour to heavily made-up women in cheap evening gowns who arrived with fat French businessmen. Furtive German soldiers or naive young men too drunk to see straight. Flick walked through the door with a mighty sense of relief. The gendarmes had dropped her off half a mile away. She had seen 2 copies of her wanted poster on the way. Christian had given her his handkerchief, a clean cotton square, red with white dots, and she had tied it over her head in an attempt to hide her blonde hair. But she knew that anyone who looked hard at her would recognize her from the poster. There had been nothing she could do but keep her eyes down and her fingers crossed. It had seemed like the longest walk of her life. The proprietress was a friendly, overweight woman wearing a pink silk bathrobe over a whalebone corset. She had once been voluptuous, Flick guessed. Flick had stayed at the place before, but the proprietress did not appear to remember her. Flick addressed her as Madame, but she said, "Call me Regine." She looked Flick's money and gave her a room key without asking any questions. Flick was about to go upstairs to her room when she glanced through the window and saw Diana and Maud arriving in a strange kind of taxi, a sofa on wheels attached to a bicycle. Their brush with the gendarmes did not seem to have sobered them, and they were giggling about the vehicle. "Good God, what a dump," said Diana when she walked in the door. "Perhaps we can eat out." Paris restaurants had continued to operate during the occupation, but inevitably many of their customers were German officers, and agents avoided them if they could. "Don't even think about it," Flick said crossly. "We're going to lie low here for a few hours, then go to the Gare de l'Est at first light." Maud looked accusingly at Diana. "You promised to take me to the Ritz." Flick controlled her temper. "What world are you living in?" she hissed at Maud. "All right, keep your hair on. Nobody leaves. Is that understood?" "Yes, yes. One of us will go out and buy food later. I have to get out of sight now. Diana, you sit here and wait for the others while Maud checks into your room. Let me know when everyone's arrived." Climbing the stairs, Flick passed a Negro girl in a tight red dress, and noticed that she had a full head of straight black hair. "Wait," Flick said to her. "Will you sell me your rig?" "You can buy one yourself around the corner, honey." She looked Flick up and down, taking her for an amateur hooker. "But frankly, I'd say you need more than a rig. I'm in a hurry." The girl pulled it off to reveal black curls cropped close to her scalp. "I can't work without it." Flick took a 1,000-franc note from a jacket pocket. "Buy yourself another." She looked at Flick with new eyes, realizing she had too much money to be a prostitute. With a shrug, she accepted the money and handed over the rig. "Thank you," said Flick. The girl hesitated. No doubt she was wondering how many more of those notes Flick had. "I do girls too," she said. She reached out and brushed Flick's breast lightly with her fingertips. "No thanks." "Maybe you and your boyfriend." "No." The girl looked at the 1,000-franc note. "Well, I guess this is my night off. Good luck, honey." "Thanks," said Flick. "I need it." She found her room, put a case on the bed, and took off her jacket. There was a small mirror over a wash basin. Flick washed her hands, then stood looking at her face. For a moment, she combed her short blonde hair back over her ears and pinned it with hair clips. Then she put on the wig and adjusted it. It was a bit big, but it would stay on. The black hair altered her appearances radically. However, her fur eyebrows now looked peculiar. She took the eyebrow pencil from a makeup kit and darkened them. That was much better. Not only did she look like a brunette, she seemed more formidable than the sweet girl in the swimsuit. She had the same straight nose and severe chin, but that seemed like a family resemblance between two otherwise different-looking sisters. Next, she took her identity papers from a jacket pocket with great care. She retouched the photograph using the eyebrow pencil to draw faint lines in dark hair and narrow dark eyebrows. When she was done, she looked hard at the picture. She did not think anyone would be able to tell it had been doctored, unless they rubbed it hard enough to smear the pencil marks. She took off the wig, stepped out of her shoes, and lay on the bed. She had not slept for 2 nights, because she had spent Thursday night making love to Paul, and Friday night on the metal floor of the Hudson bomber. Now she closed her eyes and dropped off within seconds. She was awakened by a knock at the door. To her surprise, it was getting dark. She had slept for several hours. She went to the door and said, "Who is it?" "Ruby." She let her in. "Is everything all right?" "I'm not sure." Flick closed the curtains, then switched on the light. "What's happened?" "Everyone has checked in, but I don't know where Diana and Maud are. They're not in their room." "Where have you looked?" "The proprietress's office, the little church next door, the bar across the street." "Oh, Christ," Flick said in dismay. "The bloody fools, they've gone out." Where would they have gone?" Maud wanted to go to the Ritz. Ruby was incredulous. "They can't be that stupid." "Maud can." "But I thought Diana had more sense." "Diana's in love," Flick said. "I suppose she'll do anything Maud asks. And she wants to impress her paramour. Take her to swanky places. Show that she knows her way around the world of high society. They say love is blind. In this case, love is bloody suicidal. I can't believe it, but I bet that's where they've gone. It will serve them right if they end up dead. What'll we do? Go to the Ritz and get them out of there." "If we're not too late," Flick put on her wig. Ruby said, "I wonder why your eyebrows had gone dark." "It's effective. You look like someone else." "Good. Get your gun." In the lobby, Regina handed Flick a note. It was addressed in Diana's handwriting. Flick ripped it open and read, "We're going to a better hotel. We'll meet you at the Gare de l'Est at 5 a.m. Don't worry." She showed it to Ruby, then ripped it to shreds. She was most angry with herself. She had known Diana all her life. It was no surprise that she was foolish and irresponsible. "Why did I bring her?" she asked herself. "Because I had no one else," was the answer. They left the flophouse. Flick did not want to use the metro, for she knew there were Gestapo checkpoints at some stations, and occasionally spot checks on the trains. The Ritz was in the Place Vendôme, a brisk half-hour walk from Le Charbot. The sun had gone down, and night was falling fast. They would have to keep an eye on the time. There was an 11 o'clock curfew. Flick wondered how long it would take the Ritz staff to call the Gestapo about Diana and Maud. They would have known immediately that there was something odd about them. Their papers said they were secretaries from Reims. What were two such women doing at the Ritz? They were dressed respectably enough by the standards of occupied France, but they certainly did not look like typical Ritz clients. The wives of diplomats from neutral countries, the girlfriends of black marketeers, or the mistresses of German officers. The hotel manager himself might not do anything, especially if he was anti-Nazi, but the Gestapo had informants in every large hotel and restaurants in the city, and strangers with implausible stories were just what they were paid to report. This kind of detail was drummed into people on SOE's training course, but that course had lasted 3 months, and Diana and Maud had been given only 2 days. Flick quickened her step. Chapter 35. Deirdre was exhausted. To get 1,000 posters printed and distributed in half a day had taken all his powers of persuasion and intimidation. He had been patient and persistent when he could, and had flown into a mad rage when necessary. In addition, he had not slept the previous night. His nerves were jangled, he had a headache, and his temper was short. But a feeling of peace descended on him as soon as he entered the grand apartment building at the Porte de la Molette, overlooking the Bois de Bourgogne. The job he had been doing for Rommel required him to travel all over northern France, so he needed to be based in Paris. But getting this place had taken a lot of bribery and bullying. It had been worth it. He loved the dark mahogany paneling, the heavy curtains, the high ceilings, the 18th century silver on the sideboard. He walked around the cool, dim apartment, renewing his acquaintances with the favorite possessions: a small Rodin sculpture of a hand, a Degas pastel of a dancer putting on a ballet slipper, a first edition of the Count of Monte Cristo. He sat at the Steinway baby grand piano and played a languid version of Ain't Misbehavin'. No one to talk with, all by myself. Before the war, the apartment and much of the furniture had belonged to an engineer from Lyon, who had made a fortune manufacturing small electrical goods, vacuum cleaners and radios, and doorbells. Deirdre had learned this from a neighbor, a rich widow, whose husband had been a leading French fascist in the 30s. The engineer was a Bulgarian, she said. He had hired people to choose the right wallpaper and antiques for him. The only purpose of objects of beauty had been to impress his wife's friends. He had gone to America, where everyone was vulgar, said the widow. She was pleased the apartment now had a tenant who really appreciated it. Dieter took off his jacket and shirt and washed the Paris grime from his face and neck. Then he put on a clean white shirt, inserted gold links in the French cuffs, and chose a silver grey tie. While he was tying it, he switched on the radio. The news from Italy was bad. The newscaster said the Germans were fighting a fierce rearguard action. Dieter concluded that Rome must fall in the next few days. But Italy was not France. He now had to wait for someone to spot Felicity Clariette. He could not be certain she would pass through Paris, of course, but it was undoubtedly the likeliest place after Reims. For her to be seen, anyway, there was nothing more he could do. He wished he had brought Stephanie with him from Reims. However, he needed her to occupy the house in the Rue du Bois. There was a chance that more Allied agents would land and find their way to her door. It was important to draw them gently into the net. He had left instructions that neither Michael nor Dr. Bowler was to be tortured in his absence. He might yet have uses for them. There was a bottle of Dom Perignon, a champagne, in the icebox. He opened it and poured some into a crystal flute. Then, with a feeling that life was good, he sat down at his desk to read his mail. There was a letter from his wife, Waltraud. My beloved Dieter, I am so sorry we will not be together on your 40th birthday. Dieter had forgotten his birthday. He looked at the date on his Cartier desk clock. It was June 3rd. He was 40 years old today. He poured another glass of champagne to celebrate. In the envelope from his wife were two other missives. His 7-year-old daughter, Marguerite, known as Marcy, had drawn a picture of him in uniform, standing by the Eiffel Tower. In the picture he was taller than the tower, so children magnified their fathers. His son Rudy, 10 years old, had written a grown-up letter, carefully rounded letters in dark blue ink. My dear Papa, I am doing well in school, although Dr. Wicksher's classroom has been bombed. Fortunately, it was night time, and the school was empty. Dave closed his eyes in pain. He could not bear the thought of bombs falling on the city where his children lived. He cursed the murderers of the RAF, even though he knew German bombs had fallen on British schoolchildren. He looked at the phone on his desk, contemplating trying to call home. It was difficult to get through. The French phone system was overloaded, and the military traffic had priority, so you could wait hours for a personal call to be connected. All the same, he decided to try. He felt a sudden longing to hear the voices of his children and reassure himself that they were still alive. He reached for the phone. It rang before he touched it. He picked it up. Major Frank here. This is Lieutenant Hess. Dieter's pulse quickened. You have found Felicity Clariette? No, but something almost as good.